The first interstellar mission would not present itself as a lie. It would present itself as the most solemn truth humanity had ever dared to speak aloud. The launch would be wrapped in the language civilizations reserve for acts they want history to bless in advance. There would be no shortage of words like destiny, threshold, courage, continuity, future, species, survival, and dawn. The ship would rise beneath a storm of symbolism carefully arranged to make doubt feel indecent. Children would be taught the crew names as if they had already entered the grammar of heroism. Heads of state would stand shoulder to shoulder beneath flags suddenly made irrelevant by the scale of the moment, while privately calculating how much of the spectacle still belonged to national prestige. The world would be told that this was the necessary beginning, the first road between suns, the first blade of human will pressed into interstellar dark. And perhaps, in one sense, all of that would be true. The lie would not need to be crude. It would not need to be a forged instrument read by fools or a fraud built by incompetence. It would be more dangerous than that. It would be a lie built from real engineering, real sacrifice, real mathematics, real bravery, and one buried fact that everyone with sufficient access had quietly agreed not to state in ordinary language. The ship was never likely to succeed in the way the public believed. It was not the beginning of a practical route. It was the beginning of a symbol, and symbols tolerate risk that would sound monstrous if translated back into human terms. That is what would make the story so terrifying. The first interstellar mission would not fail because humanity dreamed too greatly. It would fail because great dreams can become morally elastic when enough people agree that history itself is the beneficiary. The ship would be launched under banners of exploration and survival, while somewhere in sealed rooms, men and women with clear eyes and excellent data had already concluded that the mission's true function was not arrival. It was to establish precedent, inspire follow-up systems, normalize sacrifice at interstellar scale, and prove that the species could persuade living people to cross a line no rescue would ever be able to cross. The crew would be called pioneers. In private, some planners would know that pioneers at least expect land. These people were being sent into a probability field so thin that hope itself had to be stage managed. No civilization begins by telling itself such things directly. That is part of the tragedy. If a government, coalition, or planetary authority stood openly before the species and said, "We have built a starship whose odds of meaningful success are vanishingly small, whose communications will decay into archaeology, whose crew may die in silence or live beyond witness, and whose true purpose is not this mission alone but the psychological preparation of humanity for future sacrificial expansion," there would be outrage, not everywhere and not from everyone, but enough. Enough to slow the project. Enough to force the engineers and statesmen into a more honest language of cost. Enough, perhaps, to save the first crew from becoming wholly volunteers for a route that barely existed. So the language would bend. Feasibility would become pathway. Pathway would become first step. First step would become historic necessity. Historic necessity would become the moral anesthetic by which a project too uncertain to survive ordinary scrutiny could still be called noble. Public briefings would lean on possibility rather than probability. Graphics would show trajectories, habitat schematics, estimated windows, target system simulations, and careful language about expected outcomes, while the internal risk models told a harsher story. The vessel might survive launch. It might survive acceleration. Its life support ecology might even remain stable for a long time, but integrated mission success, defined honestly, would remain so unlikely that no parent, no lover, no child, no electorate should have been allowed to mistake aspiration for expectation. This is how large societies sometimes lie when they want to preserve their dignity. They do not invent facts from nothing. They distribute emphasis. They elevate uncertainty into rhetoric and let the pageantry do the rest. The more beautiful the mission looks, the less room remains for an unadorned sentence like this one. We are sending human beings into a darkness from which we do not truly believe they will return with a usable answer. We are doing it anyway because symbolic success may be judged by those who stay safe at home, more valuable than personal survival for those who go. The crew themselves would occupy the cruelest position of all because they would not be simple victims and not entirely informed participants either. They would be chosen from among the best: pilots, engineers, physicians, biologists, systems architects, closed ecology specialists, psychologists, perhaps diplomats of a kind, because any first mission to another star would be burdened with representation as much as hardware. These would not be fools intoxicated by cinema. They would know the mission was dangerous. They would know rescue was impossible in any ordinary sense. They would know that delay, confinement, radiation, micro-impacts, mechanical attrition, ecological fragility, and social pressure might one day consume them. That knowledge would be part of their dignity. But knowing danger is not the same as knowing deception. A person can consent to terrible odds if the odds are honestly stated. A person can choose a nearly hopeless mission if the near hopelessness is part of the vow. The moral crime in this scenario lies elsewhere. It lies in the selective architecture of truth, in what was shown, what was withheld, and what was translated into language mild enough to pass for confidence. The crew would likely receive restricted briefings, classified technical supplements, perhaps privileged access to certain failure trees. Yet even they might never see the deepest institutional conclusion in its starkest form, that the mission existed as much to inaugurate a civilizational narrative as to reach another star in any meaningful operational sense. Some among them might suspect it. The most mathematically honest would notice the evasions. The best systems thinkers would feel, in the spaces between briefing slides and probabilistic language, that the numbers were being treated like stagehands rather than sovereigns. But suspicion is not proof, and courage has its own way of neutralizing doubt. Once a person has trained for years, reorganized love around departure, and accepted that their own biography is becoming a public object, they become vulnerable to a terrible internal bargain. Perhaps the mission planners are overselling it, but perhaps that changes nothing about what the mission still means. That is how decent people can walk into a lie without ceasing to be decent. The launch would therefore feel sincere from within, and that sincerity would make the later revelation unbearable. The engines would ignite, Earth would gather itself into ceremony. The ship would rise or depart from whatever orbital infrastructure was required. Voices would break with emotion. The crew would speak to a planet unified not by peace but by temporary awe. Each farewell would be recorded, replayed, canonized. The world would not see a doomed experiment dressed up as progress. It would see the first bridge to the stars. This is the power of public narrative at civilizational scale. Once enough cameras point in one direction, doubt begins to look like treason against the future. For a while, the mission might even support the illusion. Early transmissions would arrive. The ship would be healthy. The crew would adapt. Routine systems checks would pass. The closed ecology would hold. Children on Earth would know the layout of the vessel better than the street plans of distant countries. Every message home would be treated as proof not only that the craft survived, but that the planners were right to be bold. If a mission can function for months, then for years, then perhaps everything else becomes easier to believe. That is how probability loses against image. Human beings are not naturally Bayesian when the image is beautiful enough. Meanwhile, the institutions that launched the ship would quietly reorganize around its symbolic yield. Recruitment for subsequent programs would soar. Funding would become easier. Industrial alliances once resistant to interstellar rhetoric would accept that the impossible had become policy. The mission's practical odds would matter less than the fact that it had crossed the threshold of visibility. This is the core of the lie. The ship was not merely carrying people toward another star. It was carrying permission into the future for things the future could not yet be persuaded to build without a first act of living expenditure. There is a phrase that would likely appear in classified memoranda long before it ever entered public debate, if it ever entered it at all: enabling sacrifice. It would not be written flamboyantly. It would be buried under strategic language, perhaps next to terms like civilizational readiness, expansion psychology, narrative priming, continuity incentives, interstellar governance precedent. But the meaning would be there. The first mission did not need to succeed materially in order to succeed politically. It only needed to establish that humanity could launch one, sustain it long enough to make retreat psychologically impossible, and transform the act itself into a foundational myth. Once that happened, later missions would inherit an altered moral landscape. The unsendable would become sendable because it had already been done. This is where the script becomes truly disturbing, because it reveals how progress can feed on symbolic corpses long before it has learned how to preserve living bodies at the same scale. The first ship would not be designed as a crude death sentence. On the contrary, the designers would pour brilliance into it. They would optimize, simulate, refine, redundantly shield, model ecological loops, calculate stress loads, rehearse crisis trees, and in private experience, genuine hope that perhaps, by some convergence of excellence and luck, the mission might exceed its expected ceiling. But hope in the hearts of engineers does not erase what policymakers may already understand structurally. The ship's practical value lies partly in what its launch teaches those who remain. In that sense, the crew are both honored and spent before they leave orbit. One can imagine the justifications, and some of them would sound painfully reasonable. Every great road begins with a costlier first crossing. Every oceanic route once looked absurd. Every aerospace revolution consumed test pilots. A species that never accepts sacrificial beginnings remains trapped inside its cradle. The argument is not insane. That is why it is dangerous. It takes truths history sometimes contains and extends them into a domain where the scale of non-reciprocity changes their moral weight. Testing a first aircraft is not the same as sending human beings beyond the radius of meaningful rescue and calling it the birth of a future that may never include them. Before the launch, the lie would need a culture strong enough to carry it. Great deceptions at civilizational scale are never built from secrecy alone. They require atmosphere. They require an emotional climate in which certain questions begin to sound petty, cowardly, or indecent before anyone even bothers to forbid them. The mission would therefore be accompanied by a saturation campaign so refined that many of the people participating in it would not recognize it as propaganda at all. Documentaries would appear years in advance, teaching the public to see the vessel not merely as a machine, but as the visible shape of species-level adulthood. School curricula would quietly pivot toward interstellar language. Children would draw the ship in notebooks and be told they were sketching the first outline of humanity's real future. Celebrity scientists would speak with solemn restraint, carefully avoiding outright falsehood while bathing the project in a moral light bright enough to bleach probability into atmosphere. This is how societies prepare themselves for symbolic sacrifice. They do not begin by praising sacrifice directly. They begin by making refusal feel small. To oppose the mission becomes, in public mood, equivalent to preferring stagnation, provincialism, fear, or species-level immaturity. Critics would still exist, of course. They would raise questions about cost, about feasibility, about informed consent, about whether a civilization has the right to stage-manage heroism with other people's lives. But the cultural weather would be against them. Every successful simulation, every polished render of the destination, every carefully edited rehearsal inside the habitat mock-up, every interview with calm and brilliant crew candidates would reinforce the same emotional conclusion. History has already decided that this must happen. And what remains is whether you want to be remembered as someone who helped or someone who hesitated. That mood matters because it changes the texture of consent even before any launch authorization is signed. A crew member can volunteer freely and still do so inside an emotional machinery built to make skepticism sound like failure of character. Families can support their loved ones sincerely and still do so without ever being offered the one sentence that would have changed the moral weight of every goodbye. The first interstellar mission would therefore begin lying not only through documents, but through the curation of emotional possibility. A civilization would learn to admire the ship in exactly the register required to prevent too many people from asking whether admiration was being used as anesthesia. One of the most powerful scenes in such a story would not occur after launch, but in the final weeks before it. Imagine the crew moving through the rituals of departure while each person privately performs the old human labor of translating abstraction into something survivable. One records farewell messages to be released at intervals after departure. Another walks through a garden on Earth trying to memorize what unfiltered wind actually feels like against skin. Someone else studies the public mission probabilities one more time, not because they truly believe the figures are complete, but because people facing irreversible acts often cling to the dignity of official language even when doubt has already entered them. The world sees poise. The crew live inside a quieter weather of bargaining, discipline, dread, and rehearsed faith. Now imagine that one among them, perhaps not even the most cynical, comes into contact with a more complete strategic file during that same period. Not enough to cancel the mission. Not enough to go public without being crushed by classification, legal machinery, and the sheer inertia of something already too visible to stop gracefully. Just enough to know that what the world is calling a hard but plausible opening of the interstellar age is being treated internally as a psychologically necessary, symbolic loss leader for future expansion. That person would then attend the same ceremonies, shake the same hands, smile for the same cameras, and carry inside them a truth too corrosive to speak cleanly, and too late to prevent what it reveals. This gives the launch a nearly unbearable, dramatic charge. The whole planet thinks it is watching one kind of courage, while at least one person walking toward the ship already knows that the moral situation is uglier than the cameras permit. Yet that person still boards. Why? Because the ship still exists. Because the crew they love still exist. Because exposing the lie in the final hour may destroy the mission without producing justice. Because some part of them still believes that once launched, human intention can exceed the institutions that framed it. This is not weakness. It is one of the hardest kinds of moral entrapment. It is what happens when history arranges events so that decency and complicity become entangled beyond easy separation. The first deep crack in the mission's moral surface would not necessarily come from disaster. It might come from one person on board seeing a document they were not meant to see in its original context. A systems risk annex, a strategic memo, a probability table with thresholds redacted in public versions, a planning note discussing optimum narrative handling in the event of silent mission attrition. The discovery need not be dramatic. No alarms, no conspiratorial soundtrack, no villainous confession over dim lighting. Only a line of text where two moral registers meet and expose one another. Mission viability and symbolic yield. Human survivability and civilizational leverage. Acceptable loss framed not in lives, but in precedent. What happens to a crew when one of them realizes this? That is where the script begins to feel less like speculative engineering and more like Greek tragedy in a steel shell. The person who sees such material would first doubt their interpretation, then compare versions, then perhaps show someone else they trust, then begin noticing, in memory, all the small euphemisms that once felt merely institutional and now read like camouflage. The ship would still hum, air would still cycle, Earth would still send delayed messages, still praise their courage, still tell children the crew were humanity's first true emissaries to another sun. Inside that machinery of praise, one or two people might already know they had been entered into history under a category gentler than the real one. This is one of the darkest possible experiences for an intelligent human being. To discover that your sacrifice is real, your courage is real, your technical work is real, and yet the contract beneath them was morally altered without your full consent. It is much easier to die for a cause than to live long enough to suspect the cause was calibrated around your expendability from the beginning. At first, the revelation would probably remain private. That is what makes these things dangerous aboard closed missions. Outrage is simple on Earth because space exists into which it can spill. Outrage aboard a starship must choose its timing carefully or become an ecological hazard. Tell everyone at once and you may destroy trust faster than the vessel can absorb. Say nothing and the lie becomes internalized, metabolized, almost intimate in its corruption. The discoverers would therefore do what frightened, competent people always do under sealed conditions. They would measure, they would verify. They would ask whether the mission can still remain meaningful, even if its political origin was stained. That question would divide them almost immediately. One faction would say that the deception, however monstrous, changes nothing about the practical fact before them. They are already on their way. Survival still matters. Discipline still matters. The destination, however unlikely, still exists. Better to preserve cohesion and carry the truth privately than to let anger turn the ship into its own accusation. Another faction would say the opposite. A society built atop concealed moral arithmetic cannot remain healthy if it continues obeying the hidden authors of that arithmetic. The crew deserve full knowledge. Consent cannot be retroactively repaired by silence. Notice how terrible both options are. Concealment preserves function at the price of integrity. Disclosure preserves integrity at the risk of function. This is why lies at civilizational scale are so poisonous. They do not end with the moment of revelation. They propagate choices in which every remaining path is ethically injured. A starship is an especially cruel place for such injury because there is no clean external authority left to arbitrate. The crew would have to become judge, plaintiff, and endangered consequence all at once. After launch, the lie would not feel like a constant dramatic scream aboard the vessel. That would be too simple, almost merciful. More likely, it would function like a second atmosphere, rarely visible all at once, always changing the pressure of everything else. The crew would still have work to do, systems to monitor, medical baselines to maintain, ecological balances to preserve, communication schedules to uphold, exercise, sleep cycles, navigation, diagnostics, and hundreds of other disciplines would continue making practical demands. In that environment, outrage cannot remain pure for long. It must either be metabolized into structure or decay into dangerous noise. This is why the first private circle of people who know the truth might become more secretive rather than more explosive. They would begin asking tactical questions. If the mission has already been morally compromised, what does disclosure accomplish at this stage? Is the highest duty now to truth in the abstract or to the actual survival of the people trapped inside the consequences of the lie? Can the deception be documented and transmitted home without detonating the fragile social trust on which life support itself partly depends? Every answer would injure something. That is the point. Once the ship is underway, the lie is no longer merely a political scandal. It has become an onboard systems problem because trust is now one of the vessel's hidden life support loops. This would slowly change relationships. A friendship between two officers might acquire a second layer if one knows more than the other. A medical officer may begin to wonder whether psychological resilience programs were designed for genuine care, or partly to stabilize a crew whose true utility was symbolic from the start. A commander who privately despises the deception may still defend public mission language because the alternative could fracture morale before a replacement ethic has been built. Those who know the truth would thus risk becoming, against their own conscience, partial custodians of the very manipulation they resent. Closed systems are cruel in precisely this way. They force damaged people to preserve damaged structures because collapse would be even less merciful than compromise. Eventually, however, secrecy would become harder to justify. Perhaps it would happen after the first major system failure, when sacrifice stops being statistical and starts acquiring names. Perhaps after a burial or after the first birth, when the presence of children turns every prior consent question into something more ethically radioactive. Or perhaps after a transmission from Earth arrives praising the crew as the spearhead of a viable future route, using language so knowingly false that it becomes impossible for those aboard to keep pretending the lie can be contained privately. That is when the demand for disclosure would gather a force almost impossible to resist. Imagine the scene. Not a mutiny in the melodramatic sense, but a convocation under exhaustion. The relevant files opened, risk annexes laid out, historical language compared line by line against private planning language. Crew members reading, some in fury, some in silence, some in the numbness that comes when betrayal is too large to process at ordinary scale. A few might say they always suspected as much. Others would feel something worse than surprise, humiliation at realizing how expertly their own idealism had been used against them. No enemy has boarded the ship, no alien threat has emerged. The deepest wound is that the civilization they agreed to represent altered the moral terms of representation before departure, and then built ceremony around the alteration. Once that knowledge spreads, the ship enters a new historical phase. It is no longer simply on a mission. It is deciding whether that mission remains legitimate under a revised understanding of its own origin. Every later institution aboard, from schooling to law to ritual, would be shaped by what happens in the aftermath of that revelation. Back on Earth, nothing visible would change at first. That is part of the horror. The Launch Coalition would continue presenting the mission in luminous language. Archives would be prepared. Public education systems would turn the ship into collective pride. Financial and industrial sectors would align around second- and third-generation interstellar infrastructure. The political class would do what political classes do best when a dangerous truth is useful but unstable. They would distribute it upward, compartmentalize it downward, and let the pageant exhaust the public appetite for structural questioning. Some among the architects might not even think of themselves as liars in any crude sense. They would tell themselves that all first projects contain uncertainties too severe for mass politics. They would say that open honesty about the worst probabilities would have killed the only possible beginning. They would say that the species needed an enacted myth before it could build a working route. The crew were therefore not betrayed, only burdened with history in a way history always burdens its first serious instruments. This self-exonerating logic would be one of the most interesting psychological features of the entire scenario. Human beings responsible for large-scale deception rarely wake each morning and announce their villainy inwardly. They narrate necessity to themselves until necessity sounds almost pious. They tell themselves they are protecting the future from the cowardice of the present. They tell themselves that moral purity is a luxury no species can afford if it truly means to outlive one world. These people would be intelligent, accomplished, and perhaps sincere in many of their individual affections. That would not make them less frightening. It would make them more so. As communication delay increased, the onboard crisis would acquire a special bitterness. Even if the crew chose to expose the truth to Earth, the exposure would crawl through years of light time. The message would not detonate in the institutions that lied the moment it was sent. It would travel. Those responsible would continue giving speeches, attending commemorations, writing policy, and overseeing follow-up missions while the accusation moved silently through dark. By the time it arrived, some might be dead, retired, or transformed into statues by their own public legacy. The first revolt against the lie would therefore itself become historical before it could produce consequence. This asymmetry matters because it intensifies the sense of capture. The crew do not merely discover the lie, they discover it in a medium where accountability has already thinned into astronomy. Their words can still accuse, but the accusation loses the old force of immediacy. A delayed truth is still truth, yet institutions have more time to prepare for it, reinterpret it, discredit it, or absorb it ceremonially. In this way, distance becomes an accomplice to political sin. The farther the ship goes, the easier it is for Earth's powerful to turn outrage into epilogue. One can imagine the scene aboard the vessel when this finally becomes emotionally obvious. A message composed with trembling lucidity, sent years into the future of the people who betrayed them, knowing that even righteous speech now belongs to an archive they do not control. That is not merely anger, it is historical helplessness. It is the realization that physics itself can shield institutions from the immediate moral force of the lives they spend. At some point, the truth would leak among the crew or their immediate descendants, whether command wanted it to or not. Closed societies do not keep secrets cleanly forever. They stratify them. Rumor sharpens. Tone changes. A child overhears an argument not meant for them. A maintenance officer compares restricted and public probabilities. An educator refuses to teach a state-approved version of the launch without adding a dangerous footnote. The lie would spread not like an explosion, but like dye in water, gradually, irresistibly, through intimate channels. This would alter everything about ship culture. People would begin rereading the mission backward, the recruitment speeches, the farewell messages, the founding charter, the public phrase, "First Interstellar Bridge," the promise that humanity was opening a real route rather than inaugurating a symbolic wound. Every archive becomes double. There is the version spoken in good faith by those who believed. There is the version designed by those who knew more than they admitted. Future generations aboard would inherit not only a voyage, but a contested interpretation of why they exist at all. This is where the story becomes uniquely cinematic. Children born halfway through a journey learn that their lives were structured by an act of civilizational deception committed before they were conceived. Their entire world, every corridor, schoolroom, hydroponic tray, law code, and ritual of endurance, is downstream of adults on Earth deciding that a symbolic beginning justified sending people into odds they would never have accepted if stated in ordinary terms. How does such a generation respond? Some would feel cursed, others chosen. Some would call the founders traitors. Others would insist that only the lie made their existence possible, and that existence itself retroactively sanctifies the deception. There are few more explosive debates a ship society could inherit. There is also the question of what happens to truth after the revelation, because truth does not heal automatically simply by being spoken aloud. A wounded society often imagines that exposure will produce moral clarity, but clarity is only the beginning of conflict. Once the crew understood that the mission had never really been framed honestly, they would still have to decide how to live the next morning. Air must still circulate. Water must still be tested. Navigation must still be checked. Food must still be grown. A child still wakes up hungry even if the founding charter has just been morally dismembered. This is why the revelation would be so destabilizing. It would not arrive inside a world free to pause and deliberate at leisure. It would arrive inside a sealed civilization whose continuation depends on routine remaining stronger than disgust. That would create a strange split in consciousness aboard the ship. People would go on performing the same actions with altered meanings. A maintenance round that once felt like duty to a noble mission may now feel like labor performed inside inherited manipulation. A ceremonial remembrance of Earth may suddenly sound less like gratitude and more like obedience to a parent civilization that used beauty to conceal arithmetic. Yet because practical life cannot stop, the ship's population would be forced to continue the gestures of continuity while privately renegotiating what those gestures now mean. This is one of the most cinematic and psychologically brutal aspects of the scenario. The lie does not explode the world instantly. It remains embedded in the same corridor walls, the same school texts, the same mission songs, the same plaques near the command deck, and the same recorded speeches that once made people weep with pride. The true damage, then, would not lie only in anger, it would lie in the contamination of inherited language. Words like destiny, future, species, survival, necessity, and sacrifice would no longer sound clean. They would continue to be usable because no ship society can live without large collective nouns, but they would carry sediment now. Every great civilizational phrase would become double, capable of naming courage and manipulation at once. A culture can survive many things. It is less clear that it survives easily when its central words no longer trust their own innocence. The commanders on board would face an almost impossible moral challenge. Leadership in a sealed vessel already depends on preserving confidence without descending into euphemism. After the revelation, that balance becomes nearly inhumanly difficult. Say too little, and command becomes the afterlife of the original deception. Say too much, too bluntly, and one risks dissolving the shared discipline that keeps everyone breathing. The captain, or whatever leadership body existed by then, would therefore have to attempt one of the hardest political acts imaginable: the creation of a new legitimacy inside an inherited lie. This would require language of extraordinary care. Not because the truth should be softened, but because truth without civic form can become an accelerant. A wise leadership might speak in a register neither exculpatory nor incendiary. They might say, yes, part of what launched us was false in moral presentation. Yes, some who sent us were willing to treat our lives as precedent. Yes, that betrayal matters and will remain part of our law, our history, and our judgment of Earth. But no, that does not make every life aboard meaningless. And no, it does not free us from responsibility to one another now. Such a speech would not erase the wound. It would attempt to stop the wound from becoming the ship's sole constitution. But not every society receives such language equally. Some would hear dignity in it. Others would hear capitulation. Those who most fiercely resent the lie might interpret any attempt to stabilize the ship as collaboration with its origin. Those who most fear disorder might interpret strong truth-telling as vanity disguised as morality. In that clash, command itself becomes nearly tragic. The people best suited to preserve social continuity may be the same people most likely to be accused of inheriting the psychological methods of the original planners. And in a way, the accusation would not be entirely wrong. On closed missions, the line between necessary cohesion and moral pressure is often narrower than any leader wishes to admit. Meanwhile, the ship's destination would go on exerting its cold pull. Stars do not care whether the road to them was morally clean. Orbital mechanics remain indifferent. Target windows, fuel budgets, navigational corrections, and system stress thresholds continue to make their demands. This is what makes the revelation so merciless. Even after the crew discovers the mission was partly symbolic, the physics of the mission remain real. The star ahead does not soften because the launch narrative was compromised. If anything, it becomes crueler because now the population must decide whether to continue toward it as an act of reclaimed intention or reject it as the monument toward which they were misled. This is one of the deepest fractures the story can contain. A destination can become morally overloaded. To some aboard, the target system would now represent the only way to rescue meaning from deceit, reach it, settle it, survive there, and the original lie becomes historically outgrown, even if never forgiven. To others, pressing onward might look like the final victory of the lie, proof that even after exposure, the founding manipulation still governs bodies, schedules, and hope. In that sense, the star would stop being a scientific objective and become an ethical referendum that never fully ends. This could produce a haunting onboard politics in which the same thrust vector is interpreted as either liberation or continued capture. One family might teach their children that they are the first real citizens of another star and that the noblest response to betrayal is to become larger than it. Another might teach that no world reached under concealed consent can ever feel pure, and that the only honorable future is one that remembers the corruption at its source with unrelenting precision. The ship would therefore carry not only passengers and systems, but mutually incompatible philosophies of how to redeem history. Earth's own response, once the accusation finally arrived, would likely reveal the full ugliness of institutional self-protection. Some would confess, carefully. Some would say that the public had been given all essential truths and that the difference lay only in presentation. Some would argue that no exploratory public in human history had ever been briefed in the most brutal terms possible, because societies are not mobilized by probabilistic bleakness. Others would insist that the crew were not deceived, merely spared unproductive interpretive emphasis. Such language would be infuriating precisely because it would be recognizable. Civilization always has a way of translating moral offense into managerial vocabulary when powerful people need to remain respectable. Yet there would also be genuine remorse in some quarters. Scientists who had remained partially ignorant of the political framing might feel sick at how their work had been instrumentalized. Engineers who hoped privately against the odds might discover that their hope had been used as cover for strategic cynicism. Public advocates who sincerely believed in the mission's plausibility might realize they had become unwitting priests of an institutional liturgy built around expendability. The scandal would not separate heroes from villains cleanly. It would produce concentric rings of compromise, self-deception, partial knowledge, and belated awakening. That matters because the story should not flatter the viewer with moral simplicity. The first interstellar lie would not be built by cartoon tyrants. It would be built by committees, strategic necessities, elite optimism, bureaucratic cowardice, future-oriented rhetoric, and the ancient human temptation to declare that posterity will forgive what contemporaries are not allowed to judge clearly. That is more frightening than melodrama because it is closer to how powerful systems actually wound people while preserving their own sense of refinement. The descendants aboard the ship might eventually do something Earth never expected. They might rewrite the founding mission into a text of warning rather than inspiration. Imagine an onboard archive centuries later, preserved with almost liturgical seriousness, in which the launch speeches are stored alongside the hidden probability tables, the strategic memoranda, the dissenting engineering notes, the first crew's private reactions, and later constitutional revisions made in response to the revelation. Such an archive would not read like ordinary history. It would read like scripture produced by collision between honesty and grandeur. Children raised inside that archive would learn a version of civilization very different from Earth's original self-image. They would learn that advanced societies can build beautiful machines and still speak falsely about why they are building them. They would learn that courage among volunteers does not absolve the institutions that framed the volunteers' options dishonestly. They would learn that symbolic progress is one of the most dangerous moral solvents ever discovered by intelligent beings because it can make living sacrifice feel abstractly noble to those who stay home. Most importantly, they would learn that survival after betrayal does not consist in pretending the betrayal was justified. It consists in building forms of life that no longer require deceit to make endurance meaningful. This gives the scenario one of its rare redemptive possibilities. A civilization born from manipulation might become, through suffering, more ethically serious than the one that launched it. The children of a lie might become the custodians of a more honest future than their ancestors could imagine. That does not cleanse the origin, but it does make the story larger than mere accusation. Great wrongs sometimes generate counter-traditions of truth stronger than anything clean beginnings would have demanded. If that happened aboard the first ship, its descendants might one day become not the proof that the mission was worth the lie, but the proof that the lie should never be repeated. There is also a darker alternative. Not every society metabolizes betrayal into wisdom. Some metabolize it into hardness. A ship culture raised beneath the knowledge of its own compromised founding could decide that deception is simply the price of civilizational scale. If Earth lied to open the stars, then perhaps all great thresholds require lies. If the first generation was spent symbolically so later generations could travel farther, perhaps that is merely what mature history looks like. Under enough pressure, a people can start calling brutality realism. This would be the most frightening inheritance of all because it would mean the lie does not remain at the beginning. It becomes method. Future leaders aboard such a ship might justify new manipulations by invoking the old one. Children might be taught not to resent the founding but to admire its severity. A second launch from the ship toward another star could then carry within it the very logic that once victimized the ship's own ancestors. The wound would not become warning, it would become precedent. That is the true civilizational fork hidden inside the scenario. Does a betrayed people become more honest or more resigned to betrayal? Do they cultivate institutions that force truth into the open earlier? Or do they decide that history at scale is always dirty and that only the sentimental complain? The answer would determine whether humanity's interstellar future becomes morally deeper than its planetary past or simply reproduces old sacrificial habits against a grander backdrop. And then there is the unbearable possibility that the mission fails anyway, not because the lie is exposed, not because social order collapses, not even because the ship becomes politically ungovernable, but because deep space remains deep space. A reactor ages badly. Radiation accumulates in ways no projection fully mastered. Ecological balance slips. A collision occurs. A disease enters a closed population. 1,000 ordinary terrors, none requiring symbolic interpretation, are still there waiting. In that case, the story acquires its final bitterness. Human beings were spent for precedent, told enough truth to walk aboard, denied enough truth to consent wholly, and then lost not even to some grand metaphysical judgment, but to the same cold hazard field that had always made the mission nearly unwinnable from the beginning. This possibility must remain in the script because it keeps the story anchored to physical reality. The moral crime does not replace the engineering difficulty. It sits on top of it. The lie would be unbearable precisely because the mission was hard enough already. The planners did not embellish a manageable challenge. They softened a challenge severe enough that the softening changed the ethical structure of departure itself. That is why the title cuts so deeply. What if the first interstellar mission was a lie? Then the tragedy is not only that people were deceived, it is that they were deceived on their way into one of the most unforgiving environments ever faced by the species. The lie does not merely manipulate emotion, it alters consent at the threshold of an abyss. The lie would not remain abstract for the families left on Earth. That is another place where the story has to become painfully human or it loses its force. The parents, partners, siblings, and children of the crew would have been told that the mission was terrible, yes, but terrible within a horizon that still admitted meaningful hope. They would have accepted years of fear under the belief that what frightened them was honest necessity, not rhetorical filtration shaped by people already treating their loved ones as inaugurating losses. Once the concealed framing emerged, grief would not simply intensify, it would curdle. A mother could accept that her daughter chose to face real danger for a mission whose chances were grave but genuine. It is a different thing to accept that institutions softened the numbers because a blunt account might have endangered the launch politically. A lover can survive absence by telling themselves that the person gone beyond the sky still walked knowingly into a hard but intelligible bargain. That survival strategy begins to crack when the bargain is revealed to have been staged in language designed to preserve optimism for spectators rather than full moral agency for those aboard. Families do not merely lose trust in the state when such truths emerge. They lose trust in the memory they built to survive the departure. That would produce a peculiar kind of historical rage. Not the hot rage of riots alone, though there may be riots. A colder, more durable rage that enters archives, memorial practices, public anniversaries, school debates, legal cases, and private inheritance. Some families would spend their lives trying to force official institutions to replace the word pioneers with something harsher and more exact. Others would resist that language not because they doubted the deception, but because they feared their loved ones would be reduced from agents into pure victims. The interstellar lie would therefore fracture mourning itself. It would become unclear whether honoring the crew means preserving the nobility of their choice, exposing the corruption that distorted it, or somehow holding both without allowing either to erase the other. Earth's public sphere would become a battlefield of interpretation. One bloc would argue that the revelation proves interstellar policy must be subjected to forms of democratic transparency, far more severe than those used for ordinary strategic programs. Another would say the opposite, more quietly and with greater sophistication, that the scandal, regrettable as it is, only confirms that species-scale projects cannot survive full exposure to the emotional timidity of the present. These people would rarely speak in openly brutal terms. They would prefer language about historical asymmetry, strategic communication, pathway dependence, civilizational maturity, and narrative shielding. But beneath the polish would remain the same old proposition. Some truths are too expensive to tell before a threshold is crossed. That proposition is the real antagonist in the story because it can wear respectable clothes forever. Every century produces some version of it. What changes is only the scale of the people being spent by it. In the interstellar age, the claim would grow grand enough to sound almost metaphysical. If humanity is to survive among stars, perhaps, some would say, it must learn to think in terms larger than the consent instincts of one generation. Perhaps early voyages are necessarily sacrificial in a way that cannot be metabolized politically without managed myth. Perhaps the first lie was not a deviation, but the first mature admission that cosmic history is cruel and cannot be entered by morally innocent means. A script like this must let that argument sound persuasive for a moment, because many intelligent people would find it persuasive. And then it must show why persuasion here is dangerous. Once a civilization accepts that symbolic necessity can excuse concealed expendability, there is almost no frontier it cannot narrate into legitimacy. The lie then ceases to be a regrettable founding stain. It becomes a reusable technology. The ship, meanwhile, would continue to produce ordinary life in defiance of the categories built around it. Someone would still fall in love at the wrong time. Someone would still resent a superior for reasons having nothing to do with grand history. Someone would still discover a better way to cultivate food in low-light trays. A teenager would still write bad poems about the destination star. A child would still scrape a knee against ship architecture and cry as if the entire interstellar age had not been morally compromised before their birth. This ordinariness matters because it reveals the deepest obscenity of the lie. Institutions on Earth may have treated the mission symbolically, but the people aboard never stopped being painfully, stubbornly, specifically alive. That is why later descendants might come to hate being described as evidence. Evidence of what? Human endurance, strategic necessity, the viability of long-range closed habitats, the moral permissibility of sacrificial beginnings. No one wants their grandmother's laughter, their brother's sickness, their child's first language, or their own morning labor with failing oxygen membranes translated into policy proof for people far away. And yet that is exactly what would happen if the first mission became foundational. The more the ship lived, the more Earth would be tempted to use that life retroactively as validation. A wise culture aboard might eventually reject the role entirely. It might announce in one of the rare surviving transmissions or in archives meant for future contact that their existence cannot be cited as moral precedent for any later mission unless later missions disclose their probabilities in full. Such a declaration would be one of the most powerful acts imaginable. The descendants of deception refusing to let their survival be repurposed into another deception. In that moment, the ship would cease to be only a victim of history and become a legislator of it. There would almost certainly be efforts on Earth to rehabilitate the founding planners without fully acquitting them. This is how sophisticated societies preserve continuity after scandal. A tribunal or commission might conclude that key decision-makers acted under historically severe pressures and with sincere belief that humanity's long-term survival required the mission's launch. Textbooks would soften over time. Phrases like ethically compromised necessity or strategic misrepresentation under existential conditions would appear. Museums would create rooms where visitors could feel appropriately troubled without being allowed to conclude that the system itself was structurally monstrous. This matters because the lie would threaten not just one program, but the self-image of advanced civilization. If the first interstellar mission was built partly on concealed sacrifice, then modernity cannot simply congratulate itself for replacing older brutalities with better governance and better science. It must confront the possibility that technical sophistication only refines the language in which old sacrificial instincts return. The tribunals, white papers, and commemorative redesigns on Earth would therefore be about more than punishment. They would be attempts to save civilization's reflection from the mirror the ship held up to it. Some would resist those efforts fiercely. Survivors' families, dissident scientists, ethicists, political radicals, and later generations skeptical of smooth institutional remorse would keep insisting that what happened cannot be translated into one more chapter of necessary complexity. They would say, correctly, that complexity is often where power hides after exposure. The first interstellar lie would therefore continue echoing through centuries, not because the facts were unclear, but because clarity about facts does not automatically settle what kind of civilization those facts reveal. A second ship launched after the scandal would become one of the greatest moral tests in human history. Imagine it. A later generation, determined to prove that the stars can be approached without inherited deceit, designs a mission under radically different ethical rules. Every probability is disclosed. Every worst-case model is public. Recruitment is slow, transparent, and shaped by independent oversight. Families have access to the same risk dossiers as volunteers. The language of destiny is banned from official briefings. Nothing is softened. Nothing is wrapped in transcendence. The project becomes, in effect, a deliberate answer to the original sin. Would anyone still board? That question cuts to the bone because it asks whether the first lie was only immoral or also revealing. Perhaps full honesty produces a braver kind of crew and a healthier kind of civilization. Or perhaps the original planners were right about one thing only, that species-level thresholds are so emotionally unbearable that, without the narcotic of pageantry, very few people will step across them. If the transparently framed second mission struggles to recruit or fails politically, the defenders of the first lie would have their darkest vindication. They would say, "You see, we told you the truth was too expensive for the beginning." And that is exactly why the second mission, whether it launches or not, would matter so much. It would test whether humanity can still pursue the stars once moral adulthood has stripped away the innocence of myth. If the answer is yes, then the first lie becomes historically unnecessary as well as immoral. If the answer is no, the species faces a harsher dilemma than it wanted. Not whether the first deception was wrong, but whether the future it opened can survive without repeating the psychological mechanisms that opened it. The descendants aboard the first ship might become obsessed with this question even before Earth can answer it. Their philosophers, jurists, teachers, and engineers would all circle back to the same impossible inheritance. Are we the proof that symbolic sacrifice works, or the warning that it must never be used again? Are we the first citizens of a real interstellar future, or the moral scar tissue around a coercive beginning? Is our task to complete the mission, transcend it, denounce it, or all three in proper sequence? This would give their society a depth no ordinary closed habitat could have. Every school debate is also a constitutional debate. Every memorial is also a historiographic argument. Every command appointment raises the question of whether leadership is reproducing Earth's founding psychology or consciously resisting it. Even intimate life would be touched. A couple deciding whether to have a child would not only ask whether the ship can support another life, they might ask whether bringing another child into a society born from concealed sacrifice is an act of faith, repair, or repetition. That is what makes the scenario feel worthy of epic scale. The lie does not end with exposure. It becomes the deep atmosphere through which subsequent meaning must travel. A lesser story would treat revelation as climax. This one treats revelation as the beginning of harder history. There is one last possibility, perhaps the most haunting of all. Centuries later, if the ship survives, if contact is ever restored in some damaged form, if the descendants of the first crew speak back across the light years, Earth may expect condemnation and receive something more difficult. Not forgiveness exactly, not absolution. Something worse for the conscience and better for the future. Lucid judgment without purity. They might say that the founding civilization wronged them, yes. That the lie mattered, yes. That some of those who launched them were morally cowardly, yes. But they might also say that life aboard the ship was too real, too full of unplanned beauty, love, grief, labor, and invention to be reduced to the crime at its source. That answer would be almost unbearable because it would deny Earth the catharsis of simple guilt. If the descendants condemn the planners absolutely, Earth can perform repentance. If they excuse them, Earth can quietly relax into vindication. But if they answer with something more mature, something like this: what was done to us was wrong, and what we made from it is still ours. And you must learn to build futures that are both brave and honest, because we should not have had to teach you this from inside a lie. Then the burden returns in full. Civilization would have to grow up. That may be the deepest reason this story matters, because it asks whether progress can survive losing its innocence without losing its ambition, whether humanity can still reach for the stars once it knows how readily its loftiest language can be used to disguise expendability, and whether those first people sent outward deserve more than admiration or pity. They deserve a future worthy of the truth they were denied. In the end, what if the first interstellar mission was a lie?